entire time. Oh, there
I think we might have been, because it was red when I got here.
we go.
Maybe Matt put it on, who knows?
Great.
Thanks, Matt.
All right, I'm going to call the meeting to order. A meeting of Planning and Economic Development Committee was held Monday, February 12th, 2024, at 7 p.m. in the Automatic Chamber. Will the temporary clerk, Alderman Tebow, please call the roll?
Alderman at Large Melbourne Moran Jr., Chairman.
Present.
Alderman at Large Ben Clemens.
Here.
Alderman Derek Tebow is here. Alderman Ernest Jetty.
Here.
Alderman Tyler Govea, Vice Chair. Here. We have 5 in attendance.
Also in attendance is Director Sullivan and Director Hannum. Sorry, I was not struggle with the H's.
And, the guy back there,
Oh,
Mr. Cummings,
Director Cummings also sneaked in. Sneaky.
COO.
All right, before we get to business, is there a motion for a nomination of our clerk? Alderman Clemens.
Thank you. I nominate Alderman Tebow to be clerk for the ensuing term.
Is there a nomination to close?
I move to close nominations.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Congratulations, you've been elected
Well, now we
clerk.
have to, no,
Oh,
now we
sorry.
have to vote on it.
Oh, yeah.
We voted to close nominations.
All right, closing nominations, aye, all right. So there's a motion by Alderman Clemens to elect Alderman Tebow as the committee clerk. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The ayes have it. Congratulations, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you. We'll see if that's worth congratulatory tidings.
Do we get a speech?
If you want one, I can talk.
I'll open up for public comment. Are there any members of the public here wishing to comment? Seeing none? All right, as we go into this, the discussion, I had reached out to Director Sullivan to bring up some conversation of concern within the city of multiple topics. So we've have, I'm pretty sure, at least the next 3 to 6 months booked out of topics to address and answer. The first two being more detailed conversation on the agenda, and then the last two just a brief overview about the next meeting. But the discussion, the concept corridor planning for Amherst Street and DW Highway, that came out of a conversation I'd had with Director Sullivan and many other directors. It's not often that I'm in a room with people that know their subject matter so well, and I feel completely like lost in the conversation. And that's a good thing, because I was educated very well. I had come to the directors asking for a particular project. It's like walking in, and I think I made this joke, and you walk into a car dealership, you say, I don't want a white car, but I left with a white car, because these guys are just so smart about what they do. So, but that led to the discussion about what's going on Amherst Street and DW Highway. So, Director Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Matt Sullivan, Community Development Director for the city. Just to provide a bit more detail to the chair's comments, Alderman Moran had come to city staff with a request for, I think, a variety of different things, but really had some thoughts and concern, and I think some vision for at least one property along the Amherst Street corridor. And I won't speak specifically to that property this evening, but as many of you may recall, over the last year to year and a half, myself and or other directors or planning manager Sam Durfee have been in front of this committee to talk about developments ongoing, progress, and potential future steps for planning along both the Amherst Street corridor and the Daniel Webster corridor. I'll get into a little bit of that background because I think it's important to reiterate in just a few minutes, but the intent of this evening is to, of course, answer any questions that this committee might have ongoing developments along the corridor or specific sites to the extent that we can respond to those. But to actually talk about a next step for some of this, including both the land use code and possibly some actual corridor-specific planning efforts. And so I'll get into a little bit more detail about what that might look like moving forward. But I think what there clearly is that there's a recognition that in order to actually bring forward the concepts that were pictured and really, I think, articulated within the Imagine Nashua Master Plan, there will be a need for some more focused efforts in both of those corridor areas. To give you a sense of what I'm talking about, and again, I'll get into more detail throughout the presentation this evening, if you recall, there were some corridor studies done in the East Hollis Street corridor area that were actually particularly impactful when it came to installing the transit-oriented development overlay in that area. It also was particularly impactful when it came to catalyzing redevelopment and development of some sites in the East Hollis Street corridor. To give another example of perhaps not a corridor plan, but in fact a local area or neighborhood plan, the Riverfront Development Plan similarly articulated a vision and next steps for construction of areas along the riverfront plan. And I bring those both up to say that corridor planning, while it may seem like an intermediate step, I'll talk about that in more detail, it is a critical step to actually moving forward the vision of how something is done on the ground. I think that's particularly true of complicated areas like the Amherst Street corridor and the Daniel Webster corridor. I believe I just provided an overview of this, but I'm also going to incorporate just a little bit of discussion about the MU overlay. If you recall, there was a recent zoning change to actually install what we call the mixed-use overlay along the Amherst Street corridor, which is to the north up here. And I want to talk about the implications of that, where we might be going when it comes to the mixed-use overlay and its flexibility. And really, I'll do that in the context of the land use code update that I'll close with this evening, and hopefully get you a little bit excited about that process. Although it is a regulatory exercise, I think there's some really exciting next steps that are going to happen as part of that land use code update, and I'll tie all of that together, hopefully. Just to maybe do a quick overview of sort of how I picture the roles, and I think everyone visualizes this a little bit differently, but obviously this committee is focused on a variety of land use code, housing, development, redevelopment initiatives. I think one thing that's been particularly clear talking to this group is that there's a focus on the need for affordable housing creation more generally, density, but balanced well with mixed use and economic development efforts. And so that's sort of obviously why staff are here to provide support to this committee. And I wanted to provide some framing of that as we do have some new committee members and returning committee members, obviously in the case of Alderman Jetty to this group. One thing that I think is particularly interesting to work with this committee on over the next few years is going to be advancing these concepts. As I mentioned before, and I'll reiterate several times this evening, the concepts along the Amherst Street corridor and the Daniel Webster corridor will be incremental in their implementation because of the complexity of how those corridors are built out today. But they stand to make tremendous progress, or those visions stand to make tremendous progress over the next 2 years, particularly as we bring into installation a new land use code update that will provide more clear vision. But there's sort of an intermediate step that I'll talk about in a few minutes. We're obviously here to support your vision, and I think one of the themes for this evening is, well, we'll talk about particularly these two corridors and the land use code generally in sort of that other business component of the agenda, and I think this is something that Alderman Moran is interested in carrying forward. We're happy to come back and talk about topics that may be of interest to this committee. We'll probably try to bundle those as much as we possibly can, but we know there are a lot of initiatives that you have some interest in. I know Alderman Gouveia had given some thought on that as well. So we're really here to support your vision for the city as well. So getting into this a little bit more, if you're not familiar, and I apologize if you are, it feels like we're beating you over the head with some of these things from the Imagine Nashua Master Plan. The Imagine Nashua Master Plan looked at a sort of a cross-section of the Amherst Street corridor and re-envisioned it as a sort of an urban streetscape where the buildings were more directly fronted along the street frontage, where large parking lots and other underutilized spaces were limited and in fact structured as sort of shared assets where and when possible, and really encouraged a mix of uses beyond just the existing commercial development that exists along much of the corridor and some of that residential that we also know to be actually fairly densely populated along the corridor, and trying to incorporate those two things into mixed-use development. But again, development that's fronted along the street itself. Now, I'll start right away by getting into the idea that within the Imagine Nashua Master Plan, there was this contemplation of what we referred to as a carriageway, and it's sort of in this upper right-hand side. You'll see this roadway that's running adjacent to the street. This was a very ambitious vision, the idea of having sort of a pull-off traveled way to be able to traverse the corridor and access those mixed uses along the entirety of at least a section of Amherst Street. And again, perhaps I should have led with this. This vision was really contemplated for the area from the Everett Turnpike out to the Merrimack Town line. That's really where this was considered to be a viable option. Obviously, Amherst Street, as it gets closer to the urban core, it's much more traditionally developed. It has very established land uses. And that's not to say that changes won't happen, but this vision really was aimed at, again, the Everett Turnpike to the Merrimack Town line. And so, again, the idea is integrating land uses, doing a level of upzoning to create additional density and vertical development, to integrate this idea of traffic calming through carriageways or other traffic calming measures, to integrate green infrastructure, and to really transform the corridor into a multimodal one that provides far better facilities for pedestrians, certainly, for bikes, and still allows for a level of service when it comes to vehicles, because although we may have very ambitious vision about how the corridor might work for bicycles and pedestrians, we cannot completely dismiss the idea that this is a primary east-west connector and commute pattern for many folks living to the west of Nashua and within Nashua itself. And so we still need to move cars at least at some level of service, albeit perhaps a reduced level of service beyond what's there right now, in favor of again, a more pedestrian and bike-friendly corridor with more vibrant mixed-use development. And so lots of buzzwords, but truly, there was an ambitious vision for what this corridor might look like. As I said before, and I'll talk about this in a moment, this does not happen overnight. The Amherst Street corridor includes hundreds of properties with frontage or those without frontage, and they'll be redeveloped and developed incrementally over time. Yes, there are larger properties. Think, for example, like the Building 19 property, or perhaps even some of the Law family properties. I know Brian Law has said publicly he has an interest in rethinking some of his land use in the future. There are opportunities along this corridor, but they will happen incrementally over time. And so it's how do we strategically move this vision forward while also respecting the fact that it won't happen overnight, and this is not a blank canvas upon which to paint. And so just to sort of outline what some of the challenges of the corridor are today and why some of this is a bit ambitious. Certainly it's a limited access for right-of-way. It's treated as a primary east-west transportation corridor. No question, congestion, vehicle usage, particularly during peak hours, are things that really sort of define the corridor. But there are some fairly vibrant sort of off-corridor campuses that exist in commercial areas and in some mixed-use areas. And so there is some good development along the corridor as well. So I just want to point that out, although I didn't note it here on the slide. One thing I do want to note is that the city of Nashua currently has a project within the state's 10-year plan that initially had envisioned widening the Amherst Street corridor in some form. That was really focused on moving vehicles as quickly and easily as possible through the corridor. But in further conversations and leadership through Director Photo, Engineer Hudson, the mayor, Director Cummings, and others, including some who are not here today with the city, this was really this project scope was modified. And so this is now contemplated as not a widening project, but in fact a bike ped infrastructure focused project that would enhance mobility of other transportation modes along that corridor. And so we're still some time out within the 10-year plan. That's not going to get underway in the immediate future. But what's important to note here is that modification to the scope and the focus of that DOT project is a signal that the city has been clear with other state agencies and other parties about the interest in transforming the corridor, and that there's a cognizance, and perhaps more importantly, that there's a cognizance from New Hampshire Department of Transportation that the city is thinking about this as well. And so what I'm getting at is that there are multiple parties that are buying into there being some transformation of the corridor into the future.
Director Sullivan, just for the record, Alderman Klee joined us at 7:14.
But particularly important for the conversation tonight is that while we have these concepts and they're sort of generalized in nature, they don't focus on any specific property, what we don't really fully understand is what a logical starting place might be to do this, or what infrastructure actually might be needed to accomplish the different pedestrian and other connections, to even move forward in the direction of having sort of arterial streets or other smaller streets that would calm traffic along the corridor. whether there's adequate water and sewer infrastructure to actually do the upzoning in the mixed-use development that's contemplated within the code, or what are the priority sites for redevelopment that we might want to target as a city through the land use code update, or as staff when we're working with developers. And so the take home I would say is, while we have this very ambitious vision that I think articulates what the community's priorities are, how we actually bring that forward is something that requires a bit more work, and something that I'll talk about in a minute. It could really be done through a corridor study that actually maps out some of these immediate next steps. And so I'll get into that in just a second. I did just want to, again, acknowledge the fact that there has been some work here, and that is really to speak to the mixed-use overlay work that was done by this committee and led by Alderman Moran over the last year. This was an effort to actually take what's currently a patchwork of different zoning, including general business zoning, highway business zoning, park industrial, and then some residential, to take that patchwork of zoning that has generally reflected the character of what is on the ground, and actually install a much more flexible overlay district that allows for, at a minimum, some of the development that was in the Imagine Nashua Master Plan. So what occurred is the entire area circled in red here, and it's a bit difficult to see, but we're really going from the Merrimack town line all the way again to the area just shy of Whole Foods next to the Everett Turnpike. This mixed-use overlay was installed across this entire area. And I do want to point out that for the most part, within sort of that rectangular area, everywhere that wasn't rezoned with this mixed-use overlay right here was already zoned for mixed use. And it was already allowing of both commercial and residential uses. And so that flexibility was already in place. There are a variety of reasons to do this, but one of the reasons is really sort of what we're observing now, and that is that in many areas, including those adjacent to some of the warehousing and other commercial properties, we have begun to see an interest in doing residential redevelopment or development. Dumaine Avenue is one that I'll point out. There's been some substantial new residential constructed there. We've obviously seen some interest in commercial uses along the corridor, and there's some redevelopment happening on the law property that was recently approved by the planning board. But generally, we wanted to at least open the door and make sure that we were allowing for a mixed use or residential product if we saw that interest in the development community. And so we opened that up through committee conversation, and I want to thank everyone for their input into this zoning change. I want to be clear, we haven't seen some massive proposal submitted since this was approved, but it has been a helpful tool for us to at least not have the regulatory impediment when talking to developers. If they are interested in doing housing, we at least have that ability to convey on behalf of the city that might be an option subject to planning board approval. And I'll get to this in a minute, but while that's good, I think what we're all sort of hoping to do through the land use code update is, yes, to be flexible, but to also have a little bit more guidance for the development community as far as what the actual preferred building typologies or site design might look like. And so that's something that we're working very actively on, and it leads also to this corridor study that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. I just talked about this. I should have had this up, in fact, when I was speaking, but generally the mixed-use overlay is intended to provide a flexible regulatory environment that's subject to the planning board's discretion, although there are certain standards that need to be met, but the bottom line is that the mixed-use overlay is intended to create mixed uses. And I wanted to quickly also touch on, and I'll remind everyone sort of what we had spoken about on this about a year and a half ago, but there was some interest in similarly rezoning the Daniel Webster corridor for mixed-use overlay about a year and a half ago. But before getting into that, as just a reminder, there's a very similar vision for the DW corridor as to Amherst Street. The idea of it being a mixed-use corridor with significant pedestrian and bike enhancements, while certainly recognizing the need to still move traffic through there. Perhaps an acceptance that was not the highest priority when it came to transportation modes moving through the corridor, and that really we wanted to create a solid network of transportation network that allowed for site access, but also sort of pivoted the focus of the corridor towards those that are using other modes. And I should be really clear that that's not just bikes and pedestrians, that includes public transportation as well. I know that our transit folks would be disappointed if I didn't mention that we do envision a future where more folks are riding our public transportation, although that may not be tomorrow. We want to make sure that these corridors are well designed for that level of service. So this too will take time. Daniel Webster Corridor is more challenging in some ways because of the very well-established commercial uses in the area. There's limited land availability for large-scale redevelopment. The site that you actually see up there right now is, of course, the Dow Chemical site off of East Spitbrook or Spitbrook Road. Where it says pending development there, that's the Costco that's currently in litigation. I won't offer too many comments there. But there is a vision of a couple different connections here. One being to a future trail system that might exist along the river here, which I think is a really wonderful potential recreational opportunity. The other is one that we're working actively on, and that is to bring forward commuter rail and that transportation connection, whether with the station here or at the Pheasant Lane Mall. Certainly there's a contemplation that rail is a part of this corridor's intermodal connections. But more importantly, again, the idea is that in the event that commercial tenants or sites along this corridor are interested in redeveloping into something more mixed use, I think we all, at least it has, the vision to date has been that we want to be open to that conversation and having large-scale redevelopment plans be in a mixed-use form. And so where we actually landed on this, just to give a quick summary, is that much of the corridor is already zoned for mixed use. In fact, almost the entire corridor is zoned for mixed use. And so that permission already exists today. To give you an example, the mall has been contemplated as a potential target for redevelopment. That actually currently has flexible zoning on it. And so given the right development proposal in front of the planning board or comprehensive redevelopment plan, that could be potentially a mixed-use development of some significant scale. The one area that isn't is actually a section to the north of the circumferential highway. And this is an area that includes auto dealerships, several retail tenants, several retail plazas. I would argue limited redevelopment potential in the near future, I guess I would say, but certainly an opportunity for something in the future. But the feeling was that this wasn't necessarily a priority for mixed-use overlay installation because of the lack of likelihood or probability that there would be a residential project proposed within this area in the near future. Now, looking forward, I think we should have sort of the same, or at least staff should articulate the same priorities here, that even if these continue to be commercial uses, multimodal connections for bikers, walkers, public transportation should still be a priority as we work to revision the corridor. I should have noted that, like Amherst Street, the city has a 10-year plan project that's intended to address some bicycle facilities and pedestrian facilities along this corridor. And I know that the DPW, as part of the planning board process, has been very adamant about pedestrian facility improvements wherever possible. There was a recent site plan approved for the Proctor Jones Ski Mart. There have been some crosswalks and other enhancements contemplated with the Costco redevelopment. All of that to say that pedestrians should be sort of top of mind here, whether we see a lot of pedestrian usage today. I think it's it's something that we should envision improving in this area generally as part of incremental site plans that happen. And so, I'm gonna stop talking in a second, but one of the things that I wanted to discuss with this group this evening is the idea of moving these concepts forward. And certainly one way that we're going to be doing that is through a variety of public conversations around the land use code over the coming year to year and a half, and I'll get into more detail about what that's going to look like. But in conversations with Alderman Moran, we had some thoughts as staff about some sort of interim steps that could be taken to advance these and to make them, and pardon the phrase, but a bit more real and applicable and implementable. And one of our thoughts on that, and it actually intersected with something Director Hannum was thinking about doing, was that we really could benefit from some more site-specific sort of development of these concepts that would allow us to actually have articulated design form, clear ideas about how to actually create a connected transportation network here, whether on Amherst Street or DW corridor, and really begin to plan at the neighborhood or the corridor level, how would these connections actually be made? How would we really want to see sites laid out in the future, recognizing that, we don't control those properties, that in fact they're in many cases privately owned. And to that end, really start a conversation with the private ownership community about what they might see for their properties and how that might align with the vision for, the vision for the Amherst Street and the DW corridors. And the reason that I think that's so critical is that absent sort of this beginning to engage with owners, we're going to very much be waiting for developers and property owners to come to the table. And that may take years, that may take decades. Whereas we could take a sort of proactive step to actually begin a planning process through a corridor study that would engage them, would actually create some real implementable designs in certain sections of these corridors, and would also lead directly into what we're doing in our land use code. And that is coming up with the dimensional standards, the use standards, the form-based standards in some case. I can talk about that in more detail in a second. But we really are of the belief that corridor planning might be a next step here, and a logical next step. And I can talk a little bit about what that might look like if the committee is interested in the nitty-gritty. But what we really were looking for tonight is, I think, a temperature as to whether or not these corridor-based studies might be something that you're interested in doing. We're not putting a funding number in front of you tonight, obviously, but this is something that we would look to achieve over the next fiscal year. And we'd be happy to provide some additional examples for this committee to consider as part of this conversation. But we think this is a critical next step, and we'd like to talk to you about that, and certainly would welcome your support in bringing these corridors forward and articulating the vision. So happy to answer any questions, and really looking forward to a discussion.
Alderman Tebow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been hearing about this since I became an alderman 2 years ago, so I'm wondering, why isn't it done? I'm just kidding. That was a joke. I blame Director Cummings. Again, I'm kidding on that. So when I look at the two corridors, right, Daniel Webster Highway, to me, is basically a highway that no longer should be a highway, even though it's always going to be counted as that, right, with the state. It's almost like Main Street, where that's not the thoroughfare anymore to get places. Unfortunately, Amherst Street kind of is still. To get to Milford from anywhere in Nashua area, you got to go through Amherst Street, as painful as that always is to do. And that's why Exit 8 was built many, many years ago, so you at least calm some of that traffic. But now it's at a point where there's so many places being built there or have been built that the traffic's just getting worse. So I'm not sure how that's going to be handled, because that's going to be a tough one. Daniel Webster Highway, although there's not as many opportunities, I think there's some wasted areas or wasted space areas, and obviously where Toys R Us once was and Amazon no longer going to be is a wasted parking lot. I even look at places like where Trade Land is, and I think there's 2 or 3 or 4 more vape shops in there too. But in that space there, that parking lot is not full, and you can probably, somebody could be creative with that space and make it more, but again, you gotta have the people to develop it, right? So it's not just what we want, it's obviously, you gotta have the demand of somebody to fix that or change it. I do think there's some opportunities down there that I'd like to see, especially since we don't consider it really a thoroughfare anymore. Although, for the one issue I think there is that you can't get to the mall going south without going down Daniel Webster Highway. There's no exit, right? So obviously coming this way, there's an exit, and I wish the state would give us that exit, because it would definitely take some of that traffic, combustion, whatever you want to call it, jam out of there a little bit. Just go mall to highway to mall, almost like we have with the Sheridan down. It's exit 1 back and forth, and you're out of there. You don't have to go down any other roads. So I think there's opportunity there. I do think Amherst Street's longer, so there's a lot more places that you could do things with. But I just think until there's an easier way to get to Milford, trying to calm that traffic when it's calm now because you're in traffic jam. So bikes can go in between while I'm just sitting there in traffic. But as far as fixing that, I don't know how that's going to be an easy fix. And I mean, you kind of said it wasn't going to be an easy fix. So I see that one almost having a longer time, so.
Can you respond?
Just
Alderman
briefly, yeah, I think, and interestingly, the concept within Imagine Nashua sort of thought about what that might look like. And really going to the idea of things that we need to understand better. In the Imagine Nashua concept, these carriageways the carriageways themselves may have been a very ambitious thing, but what's not so ambitious and is very realistic, in fact, is the idea of having local streets or private driveways or connectors that are off of the main corridor that allow people to move effectively between different private sites. And believe it or not, this community has done this for many, many decades, quite frankly. If you look at the Pheasant Lane Mall area, there are several connections between private sites that allow you to get off of the main thoroughfare and into a private area, but traverse between multiple properties and shops. And so that was actually quite visionary when it was done, because it required the assemblage of a variety of different easements and things. And so that would be one way to approach the Amherst Street corridor. Maybe not a carriageway. Maybe it's another network of local streets that are set farther back. Perhaps it is the carriageway. There are ways to get cars off while also creating green space and alternative transportation mode access. I think that was what was really neat about this concept, and it would address some of that east-west traffic for local users.
Great, thank you.
Alderman Clements.
Yeah, I agree with what you just said, Director Sullivan. I think the carriageways, if you take, for example, and I've been down there more often than I want to be, but Route 9, for example, in through Brookline and Newton, Mass.
Yeah.
When you look at that, some of the developments that were there, that's what they did. They put carriageways in. It's a nightmare because you have the carriageways are in front of the buildings that they serve. So the problem is that you have people cutting around in there to get around traffic. They're one ways. So if you miss a space, you've got to keep going, go all the way up, go all the way back around, and whatever, right? The better plan is to have a road like that, like we do, like you said, down at the DW, like at the Pheasant Lane Mall, behind there, so that it's separate and it keeps the main thoroughfare clear. Because the problem, and I agree with Alderman Tebow, the problem is that 101A is the main thoroughfare for anyone in Nashua to get anywhere west of the city. So it doesn't matter if you're going to Milford, if you're going all the way to Keene, Wilton, whatever, you have to drive on that road. So I was actually a big fan of them increasing the lanes to 3, because I thought that's, as the population in Nashua grows, it's gonna grow along that corridor. We need to have it be able to handle more traffic. If we're not gonna do that, then I think we need to approach the town of Merrimack and the state, which I think it's a state road, Continental Boulevard, and have that, which connects up in Merrimack back to Amherst Street, that should be expanded into 4 lanes, because then you would have a connection from exit 10 all the way down to where it meets up where the auto fair and the McDonald's Friendlies used to be. And so that would alleviate our traffic here in Nashua if we're not gonna add a lane. But I think this needs to be a regional proposal. And I think the first step to this is to really look at what is the traffic count, and if we were to add residential, depending on how much, what would it add to it? Because I think what we're gonna find is that slowing down the traffic on that corridor is not gonna be a good idea.
So, Director Sullivan, before I get to Alderman Klee, would a study propose details like that if it needed to be regional to go to the national, the regional planning?
So a couple, yes. I think a couple things for consideration. You know, the corridor study that I'm at least contemplating in this moment is much more of a sort of a land use focused document, but it can't be done without some level of understanding about whether there's a need to improve the public road facilities in the area. So as much as I'm talking about something land use, it certainly requires some insight into traffic. And to that point, you know, this is a conversation that we need to advance with DPW and engineering. If they're going to, you know, if we're going to move forward with this, they certainly need to be a part of it. And we do need to have an understanding of not only the existing traffic throughout the area by all modes, but also what the projections might say when additional housing is developed. And, you know, I think ideally we hope that there'll be a shift in the way the different transportation modes are being used. I know that won't happen quickly, but I think it would be good for us to have a conversation about as a community, about moving folks towards alternative transportation modes that would hopefully offset any increase in traffic. But that's also a very ambitious conversation. And so NRPC would be a wonderful group to engage on this front. They're having a lot of conversations about 101A and are well connected to the communities of Amherst, Milford, and Merrimack, of course. And so if we were proposing anything of some significant impact to east-west flow, they, DOT, and others would need to be involved. Now, they have, to an extent, you know, they've been involved in the 10-year plan project and the different changes in scope there. But certainly, if we're going to move forward with a level of corridor study that's specific, they would be a stakeholder that would have to be at the table for that conversation. Because as much as I and perhaps others' ambition to have this be one lane east-west, that's not a reality in the near future. And so we have to be realistic and have something that's truly implementable and not, frankly, dead on arrival. That would be my concern.
And planning, I guess that's the name of our committee.
Right.
Alderman Clemens.
Well, yeah, and just to that point, that last point about the one lane, I mean, you, with places like Target and Market Basket and all of that way out there, you could never accomplish that in a realistic way along that corridor, because there's too many large retailers that have big trucks that come down, plus the post office is back there as well. So we have to take into consideration the things that are already there, even though yes, we want to look to the future to see what's there, but we don't want to drive out businesses that are there either.
I agree. Alderman Cleveland, Alderman Jetty's on the
Yes.
committee.
Absolutely.
Alderman Jetty?
That's okay.
He
she
yields
had
to
her hand
you,
up first,
Alderman
that's
Clee.
fine.
But you're on the committee, so I defer if you want to speak.
Okay, well.
Yes.
one of
I'm
us
getting
should
my
go
bearings
ahead.
again.
No, please, I
The committee
understand.
changes.
Mhm.
So, you know, hearing you talk, I've got a lot of thoughts, and a lot of questions. I don't have many answers for you, but, so, you know, when I think about the Amherst Street, and I think about, you know, one of the problems I've have with Amherst Street is, you know, if you're trying to, when you go down the street and you've got all those little strip malls, you know, with many retail establishments, and you know, it's very difficult to see what's there. My wife has a much newer car than mine, and she tells her car exactly where she wants to go. And there's a nice woman in the car that tells her how to get there and exactly where to turn. I don't have that advantage in my car, so I find the, you know, all of those retail establishments, you know, and you're going down Amherst Street, and there are people who have places to go and times to get there, and so they're, you know, you oftentimes miss wherever it is that you're trying to get to. So when you mention the carriage lanes, you know, that seemed, you know, I've seen that in southern states. Seems to work very fine. You know, I haven't had your experience, but that's, you know, we have to pay attention to, you know, what actually happens. But, you know, the carriage lane seems, you know, like you have a general idea where you want to go. You can get off the main road and allow the main road to move, and the carriage lane, you can go a little more slowly. But then I think about the topography there, you know, it's, you know, right off of Amherst Street, there are stretches where it, you know, the buildings are much higher than the road. And so trying to build a carriage lane there, I mean, I know that you can do anything you want to do if you've got enough money, but it just seems, you know, like problematic to me at first, when I first think about it. You know, and I think of, you know, Daniel Webster Highway, which you mentioned about the Pheasant Lane Mall, you know, putting the carriage lane type road, you know, behind buildings. Yes, I don't know if that would be practical in these strip mall areas along Amherst Street. But, you know, Daniel Webster Highway, I think of Pike Street. You know, Pike Street is, you know, it's all residential, but it, you know, it is kind of its own carriage lane off of the main road. It, you know, it's a fascinating topic, and I look forward to, you know, hearing what the experts would provide to us. The idea of a study is something I would be very much in favor of.
Director Sullivan.
And I think Alderman Jetty is absolutely correct. I struggle when I look at and I think this is my big struggle, one of many, but when I look at all of the sites along the Amherst Street corridor particularly, I have a hard time imagining how these concepts could in fact be constructed and implemented there, because as you say, particularly on the north side, if you're thinking of the merge that happens after you take the right from the Parkway onto Amherst Street, Somerset Parkway, you have all those retail plazas there, each with their own independent, if not entrance and exit, perhaps a separate entrance and a separate exit. And then you have a steep embankment leading up to them, and then a steeper embankment behind them where they've been cut in. It's very challenging to imagine. But what I think one of the things this study would do is it would trigger a conversation about access management that I think is long overdue. Unfortunately, the way that we regulate is on a site-by-site basis, typically. And what that produces is each site has its own parking, it has its own entrance and exit, it has its own everything. And many of those facilities could in fact be shared amongst a variety of property owners if there were in fact agreement and we were able to plan that comprehensively. And so the retail plazas that I'm thinking of that have, you know, one of my favorite restaurants is actually in there, they could be connected with a shared driveway, and entrance and exit ways could be closed. And it would allow for you to say, oh, I know the business I want to go to is somewhere in these 20 businesses, but I can at least get off safely here, get into that carriageway or some other shared access drive, and find it without putting my life at risk in that location. And so I think there again, this is one of those opportunities to take what's a very high level concept and actually look at what exists there and see what really could be done. Because I think, you know, it's possible that any one of those property owners could come to the city tomorrow and say, I want to do something with my site. And absent some sense of what we would like to see there, they're likely going to do whatever the easiest thing is that's allowed by the zoning, and that might not be what we actually want as a community. And so I want to use this opportunity just to say that one of the things that we would do through this corridor study that I mentioned briefly before, but is really, really important, is property owner engagement along that corridor to understand a level of buy-in so that these folks actually can play a role in the sort of the results of the corridor studies, so that when they're thinking about an alternative use for their property or they're thinking about a redevelopment, we've actually given them sort of a leg up in having that conversation with a potential redeveloper or doing it themselves. It would position them to make a significant step that they otherwise might not make. And so I just think that's a really important part to mention.
Thank you. Follow up?
Yeah, please. So, from my, I think it was when I was on this committee previously, or maybe it was with the Regional Planning Commission, but I remember being told that, that the state had identified Amherst Street or Route 101A, as a problem road, that the number of cars, triggered something that gave it priority as far as the state is concerned. So, do you know what I'm talking about, and what's the status of that?
So, I do, and, I think we hear this term often in planning and transportation, transportation planning specifically. And I believe what you were speaking to, Alderman Jetty, is this road being a level of failure, and that's what's referred to as. Failure, the concept of failure along a road, though, is based traditionally on the ability to move cars at a certain volume or a certain frequency. Failure is typically conveyed by transportation engineers and traffic engineers as a negative thing. Some of the greatest places and spaces that I know are failing transportation systems. They're downtown areas with incredible congestion where things move slowly, where vehicles are not moved quickly and they're deprioritized. And I say that to say that yes, DOT has identified that this is a road with incredibly high congestion. It's a road that the way it's designed today is to move cars, and so I respect that they look at it that way. The question that I ask myself is, how important is failure? Is failure of the movement of vehicles more important than the ability to safely move pedestrians and bicycles and the ability to create this being a vibrant public space? I think that's a question for everyone to consider, but there are several transportation decisions before the city right now, this being just one of them, but West Hollis Street corridor being another one, where I think there's this question out there of what is really most important, safety, security, accessibility, or the ability to move cars. And I think it's a really good policy debate for you as the alderman and for the mayor and others to be having, because I think in some cases that there's a shift in priorities, and I think that maybe we will be moving towards things that maybe fail more, but are much better transportation networks for a variety of different uses. So you gave me a soapbox to stand on to say that, but that's, I believe, what the state has referred to here. There are some other specific issues along the corridor, but the state generally, they're shifting in their thinking, so I'm really happy about that, but they generally are interested in moving vehicles because they know this is a critical east-west, connector, and that's what their priority has been traditionally. But I think they've also been very respectful and supportive of the fact that the city is reconsidering that, and therefore sort of shifted the focus on the project that's in the 10-year plan.
Thank you. Alderman Clee, then Alderman Goya.
Thank you. I have a few comments and questions. I do like the carriage lane idea, and that particular clauses that you were speaking of, it would work very well. I can't tell you how many times I've turned into the wrong one and said, the heck with it, I'm just gonna park my car here and walk to where I wanna go, even if I have to go down that slightly muddy hill, just because it's not worth trying to get out into Amherst Street. And my husband will tell you, I avoid Amherst Street at all costs. I used to live on Amherst Street. A couple of decades ago, I lived at Canongate. And that was where Market Basket was a soccer field. And the hotel, I'm not even sure which one it's called now. At one point, it was the Crown Plaza, and I think it's the Clarion now. I'm not sure.
Doubletree.
Doubletree, thank you. So I saw that being built. I saw Exit 8 being built. All that didn't exist. Dartmouth didn't exist. We had woods behind us. So I watched Amherst Street slowly kind of growing up. And I watched that traffic. And I know what it was like to try to bike from there to Milford. You took your life in your hands. It's even worse now. And Director Sullivan, you know specifically I'm not gonna even mince words here, the Dunkin' Donuts nightmare that's there. We put up no parking signs, and still, because of that drive-through, people are still parking, people are trying to bike, trying to maneuver this. So I think anything we can do to get cars off the road that are going there. I always travel in that left lane, unlike what I do on Main Street, I do the right lane. The left lane, simply because you never know when a car is slowing down to go in or out of these shops. So something like that, and I would think that those businesses would relish a little bit more than having to deal with angry people like me going, your sign isn't big enough, or you changed, and Federal Express isn't there anymore, it is there, and so on. But the, I do take other roads to not go on Amherst Street. I take Manchester to Tinker Road, and I take Tinker Road as far as I can go, and then get onto Amherst Street when I have to. If I have to go to Walgreens, then I go Tinker Road to, over by where the community college is. If I'm going further, I go all the way down to Continental Boulevard or something of that nature. But that puts a lot of pressure on those roads too. When I first started doing it, Tinker Road would take your, you would lose your fillings trying to drive on that road because it was so filled with potholes. But now that it's a much smoother travel, I'm seeing more cars on that. And that, to be honest with you, is a very winding, dangerous road. So we're actually taking people off of a road that should have these cars and do that. So I think anything we can do to make things better. Slowing traffic might be good, but you're going to frustrate people, and they're going to do the Tinker Roads, which really are not meant to handle that many cars. And that's my biggest concern if we don't do something about Amherst Street. So I don't think necessarily slowing down that traffic is the right thing to do. Mitigating, to be honest with you, when I'm at Walgreens and I want to get to Market Basket, I go across the TJ Maxx parking lot, in behind that Frontiera's, over to that road, and go in behind that way. I'm off Amherst Street. I would rather drive through a parking lot than to have to go back onto Amherst Street. That Amherst Street is my nightmare. Well, parts of Main Dunstable are too, but and not Main Dunstable, I'm sorry, West Hollis. But I don't, even though Daniel Webster can be congested and so on, I don't think that is as bad as this. So I think any studies you can do to look at all aspects of it, whether it be carriage, I'm not for bringing it down to one lane. Don't deter people from driving on there. I love mixed use, but I think we have to start planning for the future, because as I watched Amherst Street slowly grow up, and I've only been in Nashua since like 1986, so Amherst Street really developed quickly through that time. I've been in the area since '84, and even between '84 and '86 and '87, there was a big boom on that road. And so the problem is that, as you pointed out, each plot of land was given thumbs up or thumbs down, or you need this, entranceway, exitway, and it's created this mess we have. So anything you can do, working with private developers, doing, studies with the eye that we're not going to push traffic somewhere else. Main Street, we want to slow it down, and we will, and we're working to push traffic elsewhere. Let's not do that with Amherst Street. The Continental Boulevard is an option, getting people to go down that, but we all know what Fridays are like from about exit 5 or 6 to, past exit 10. You're just stuck in traffic there. People aren't going to do that either. They're going to go Amherst Street. So those are just kind of quick comments. And one more thing, if I may.
For sure.
Whatever study we do, keep in mind the crossing of Amherst Street. There's that tiny little median. And I can tell you from a person who had to get, from one side to the other, just trying to stand in that little median, trying to get over there, cars going all around you, was a very scary thing. And as a driver, I see people doing it all the time. They have to kind of go over that little guardrail and kind of straddle the guardrail to keep themselves safe. So crossing areas, and I know that there are crossing areas, but across over by where 7-Eleven is, or even across by where the Market Basket opening is not safe either. We've talked about crosswalks over by the community college and so on, where you have to cross one side or the other side. We really need to look at the pedestrian, the bike, the keeping traffic on that highway and keeping all those things there. So I think your job is, you're gonna have a real easy one to do. Because I said take care of everything, but, I mean, truthfully, we have to. We can't take the cars off there. They need to be there, but we also need to create safety. So we have to work with these private, and hopefully they'll come to the table and listen. So, you know, I please move forward with anything we can. And I have spoken to DOT, you know,
Yep.
and they point fingers. They say, nope, sorry, this isn't our part, this is the city's part. And the city says, well, we have limited, I know you can't widen it because then you've got to deal with all of those towns all the way down, Merrimack, Amherst, and so on. So I know that because it's an agreement. I know there's a fancy name for it, but isn't there some kind of agreement with all of us all the way down, a compact of some sort?
Well, so it's a compact area, but, yes, I mean, we can't change the cross-section on our own, obviously, as a city. It's a controlled access right-of-way for the state of New Hampshire. But anything that's done along the corridor has to be with the direct consultation of DOT, and they have to play a role in guiding it. Now, does that result in different changes to 101A through different communities? In some cases, it does. The 101A is different inherently through Amherst, Merrimack, Milford, and certainly Nashua, but the state's going to play a role in any conversation that takes place. And I think I've maybe overcharacterized this as a transportation study that we're talking about. It certainly will look at that, but it is at its core, an advancement of some of the other concepts, such as use, such as density, such as the ability to share infrastructure like parking. It's not just transportation, although we know with these corridors, that is a core sort of component of it. But it is the idea of revisioning some of these properties to complement the vision that was in the master plan.
Thank you. Thank you.
Alderman Govea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll start with what we're talking about now. So Amherst Street, I think it's fantastic that we're having this conversation about how to make that corridor better. Obviously, I represent kind of half of Amherst Street, if we will, and I share that with my colleague Alderman Dowd, and I know based on my conversations with the constituents, it really is a traffic issue, and that would be really my one priority is how can we make these roads better? I think it's too heavily trafficked and used of a road to want to slow it down even more. I think it's too kind of vital to how you would get to 101. And as we heard earlier, if you wanted to get out to Milford or even Keene, this is the way you're going to go unless you drive up the highway to 101, which would make no sense. But to me, it's not really an area I would want to slow down, and it's not something I would advocate for slowing down. And I know my residents who live on Amherst Street, as well as the other side of the ward, it's a constant complaint about Amherst Street and the traffic that we're seeing on there. So I think moving cars would really be a strong priority for me. I think it's nice to kind of look at the big picture here, and these plans would look great. I think anything in that corridor will look really nice, but at the end of the day, I think it really should come down to how we can move cars efficiently in that area and still bring some curb appeal to that area as well. One area I've always thought, and it is the way top of Amherst Street. It would be right on the Merrimack border. It'd be that Northwestern Boulevard kind of area back by the further down Amherst Street Market Basket and the liquor store. I've always thought that would be a good area for something. What that is, that's kind of beyond me, but I've always thought that was kind of underutilized land that really could be something special should the right developer be able to look at it and acquire that land and develop it. It really would be, it could be very nice and a nice part of Nashua that I feel isn't as tapped, but a lot of that would go with everything else we're looking here on Amherst Street. So I've always seen that one. And then third, and it kind of goes off of this Amherst Street corridor as much as I love to talk about it, but is there any talks about that Northeastern Boulevard corridor? I've always kind of found that is an area that has been underutilized and could be better. And I know it's a smaller stretch of land, but could be one that could look very nice and could be redone to kind of pop for those Ward 9, Ward 8 area residents.
Yeah. If
Sorry, Director Sullivan.
No, that's quite right.
Just for the record, you are sitting in Alderman Sullivan.
I
Oh,
know. I noticed that.
I
by the
looked
way.
straight
about
ahead
that.
and I saw Alderman Sullivan, sorry.
sorry, Alderman Sullivan. So that I'm glad you brought that up, and that's not alone. There's also conversation too about Broad Street. If you will permit me, I want to kick the can of answering that question to maybe the next item on the agenda, because we are actively looking at that. Just a quick summary. Northeastern Boulevard is actually, like some of really, I think, Amherst Street corridor, is one of the few sort of remaining industrially zoned areas that we have in the city. And the conversation in the Imagine Nashville plan was very much that perhaps that wasn't an area for mixed-use development being a priority, and in fact, it should continue to remain as sort of industrial or warehousing or other uses. And so, I think that was clear from the plan, but I think we're certainly open to discussion. There are residential developments adjacent to Northeastern Boulevard. There are some vacant structures down there. There are some underutilized buildings, of course, and so I think anything should be on the table, but I think there will be, as part of the land use code update process, I think there'll be a very real conversation of, not just there, but elsewhere, preserving industrial ability. And I'm not sure where that's going to head, but I think there are some areas where we legitimately need to protect the ability to do industrial uses or warehousing uses, or advanced bio and other things we may not be contemplating really clearly right now. We've got to provide some space for that, and it can't just be in mixed-use zones that are flexible, because you may, as we've seen in some cases, you may see industrial uses next to residential uses, and that may in fact not be a good land use. And so I think you're going to see through the land use code that we actually seek to pull back a little bit on this very flexible zoning that we have in many areas. I think we've used it effectively as a tool to catalyze redevelopment and development, but in a few cases we need to be a bit more deliberate about exactly what the community wants, not leaving it sort of so broad to the development or open to the development community. And so I think Northeastern might be one of those areas we need to have that conversation.
Thank you, Director Sullivan. Alderman Tebow and then Alderman Clement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Alderman Gouveia, don't make the traffic worse by my area. Ward 8 is good just as it is. I'm kidding, of course. But so, going back to something Alderman Gouveia said about Northwest Boulevard, which is on the opposite side of the city, right? This was way before his time, but that used to be pretty hopping over there. We had Zayre's store, and that whole thing was filled with stuff. But over time, it's changed a little bit. But there are some warehouses back there and stuff, and it's just who owns the land, I don't know. But so a couple points, and then I got the major question I'm going to ask you. I don't think slowdown is what you really mean, or what we really mean when we talk about the Amherst Street traffic, because it's as slow as it's going to get now. I think you mean by using this corridor study and the land use and all this stuff is to make it flow better. We don't want to be speeding on it, but we also don't want to be stuck in traffic. So I think by building out these, whatever you may do or not do, depending on what it shows, it's going to be a better flow of traffic and not slow down to where we're calming it down like we would a Main Street, which is not really the same way when we say slow down. I think it's two different things. And another comment is the Dunkin' Donuts that has that. Do we have some kind of law, and this is not my main question here, but a law, or should we be looking at things that have a drive-through that don't have enough space to accommodate a certain amount of cars? Because if we don't, I'll be ready to sponsor one right now, because they need to have the space to be able to have that. And again, that's off the track, but I just, Alderman Klee did that. And I'll leave you with my final question, my important one, right? Yeah, I know, she brought it up, so.
I'll take the blame for it.
How much is this corridor study? Now, Alderman Jettie said he's for it. I'm most likely for it.
Yep.
But it all comes down to, how much money can you raise in a bake sale in the planning department, right? So how expensive do we think this is actually roughly, and I know you haven't gone and bid it out or anything, but how much would it cost roughly?
So I always work backwards first. So relative to the question about cost, I don't have an estimate before you this evening. The intent of tonight's conversation was just to get a general sense of whether this is something you're interested in doing. Frankly, I didn't expect there to be anything other than interest in advancing this, but I know that there needs to be a more deliberate conversation about what the cost will actually be. My expectation is, and I'm not going to give you a number tonight, but my expectation is this will be something that would be considered as part of the fiscal year budget that we're going into. I'm not sure exactly where it would be in the budget, quite honestly. So to be continued when it comes to an actual cost estimate, but it's certainly something that will go beyond what I'll say my current operating budget is in the community development division.
It's not what I wanted to hear.
But it's also not something, we're not talking about, and I guess I will use a number, we're not talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars here, at least with what we're initially contemplating. I want to be really clear about that. But it is something that requires a level of consideration, either within a capital budget or as an expansion to my contracted services line, or however we structure it with other departments. You gave me an opportunity to clarify a comment that I made, and that was that, I'm not suggesting that the goal or stated objective is to slow traffic. I want to be really, really clear about that. And I actually want to go back to this concept. Even in the Imagine Nashua plan, there was still a recognition that over to the right here, you would still have a very active and well-traveled thoroughfare along the Amherst Street corridor, right? That would not go away, but what would be installed would be a much more dynamic, sort of active streetscape for businesses and other developments to abut off of that very active traveled way. And so one of the first things that was flagged here by many was, well, we're gonna need additional right-of-way or space to do this in. That's part of the conversation that we need to start with the private property owners, quite honestly, because this is space that in many cases they own and they alone control. And so there'll very much need to be a conversation with them to gauge their interest in implementing this type of design, because we're not proposing to eliminate or road diet Amherst Street, at least in what we've initially done here, because there's a recognition that cars still need to be able to move. Now, I would argue that depending upon how you do this, you will produce a level of traffic calming that wouldn't necessarily modify, I want to make sure I say this correctly. If you were to do a carriageway concept or something that does local roads and takes cars off of the road, what you would eliminate in sort of stop-start traffic, you may actually get slower moving traffic, but more consistently moving traffic throughout the corridor. That to me would be a better product than what you currently have out there, which, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I find myself rushing from stoplight to stoplight, because if you get all the greens, you're good to go for a while. That sort of ebb and flow, or that rubber banding of traffic, I think could be greatly helped by an alternative configuration of the roadway. So you're right, it's not a slowing down per se, it's sort of it's a moderating of the flow out there through street design standards. I think you asked me another question.
A Dunkin' Donuts.
Can we enforce laws at Dunkin' Donuts, basically?
I think
We've tried.
I think your question was.
I mean, it's already there, but I'm talking about future.
Yep. So you certainly can. We have very clear standards within our site plan review regulations or in zoning code as far as what the queuing expectations are. That's what we refer to it as. The queuing length needs to be for a drive-in restaurant. There have been some interesting things happening though in the post-COVID world. I myself on the weekends often find myself picking up something from the drive-thru that I've mobile ordered and therefore not parked and gone into to pick up. And a lot of people are doing this now. And so drive-through queue lengths have changed substantially in the post-COVID world. And we also just have some very successful businesses that have done drive-through models. I won't name any of them, but they've created some issues both within the right-of-way and even in private sites where their queue lengths are very long. And so how do we solve that? We likely should look at, I would argue, decreasing parking requirements for some of those uses, but increasing the requirements for queue lengths and being really clear that those queue lengths can't otherwise impede vehicular flow either on site or certainly within the public right-of-way, which has been the case with that business that you mentioned, creating a very unsafe situation there in peak times. And I will say, to just sort of defend Dunkin' Donuts, they were very responsive when we reached out to them. They tried to install some measurements, but even when you have a sign that says you shall not queue in the right-of-way, that person itching to get their coffee is going to do what they're going to do. And so I do want to defend Dunkin' Donuts a bit, that they've tried to be a good tenant along 101A, but human behavior sometimes takes over, and we probably need to explore some street standard designs that prevent that, one of which might be eliminating the area to queue along the right-of-way in some way, shape, or form, and providing for a bike path or something else.
Mr.
Anyway.
Chairman, may I?
Is it about Dunkin' Donuts?
Yes, just a real quick comment on it. The problem with Dunkin' Donuts isn't just the number of cars that are queuing, it's the type of vehicles. There are tractor trailers that are queuing there, which create that. So that is not the fault of Dunkin' Donuts, but the fault of those that are itching to get their coffee and so on. So
I
I
know-
didn't mean to per se that, but it is
Yeah.
becoming a nightmare.
I know where, a cruiser could park to get some money for the general fund. Alderman Clemens and Alderman Jettie.
Thank you. So just to kind of reiterate my comments from earlier, I think that whatever we do with, and I know that this is a land use study, but I think that we would be amiss if we did not involve the Regional Planning Commission insofar as to see what we could do about Continental Boulevard in Merrimack. Because right now, where that connects with Amherst Street, it's 2 lanes, all the way down to exit 10. And then from that point, you can either go right or left, or, I'm sorry, you can either go straight or right. Right would take you to exit 10, straight would go to exit 11. And both of those are 4-lane roads. If that could become 4 lanes all the way down to Amherst Street, then you could potentially, once the turnpike is 3 lanes on either side, all the way through from exit 8 to exit 10, which it will be because that's in the next 10 years plan for the turnpike, you could have a situation where if you're coming from Milford and you want to get to Tingsboro, it would be faster to go up to exit 10 and then down the highway that way, which would avoid Amherst Street altogether in Nashua if you didn't have a reason to go that way. And so I think that would be something to look at in combination with what the state is going to do with the turnpike and what could potentially happen up there, because I believe, as I said, I think that is also a state road as well. So I don't know if that can be explored in addition to this, because again, I think we need to know how much vehicular traffic we're going to create by doing something like this, where we're adding, potentially residences, businesses, things like that. How much traffic are we gonna be adding here? And if we can keep the traffic that's coming from the west, that is just using it to be a pass-through to get to the highway, then I think maybe we might have an opportunity to reduce what's on that road naturally. So I would like to see some sort of portion of this study look at that traffic and look at what we could potentially do with our neighboring towns.
Director Sullivan, is that feasible?
Yeah, I think I need to think a little bit more about that and how it would be incorporated within the study, but I think certainly, again, NRPC needs to be engaged, and I do think we need to have an understanding about what the connections are to this particular corridor, and so, I think, let me explore that a bit further, because I certainly recognize it's a priority and it needs to be looked at. It's not something I initially contemplated, but no question that the Parkway, or Boulevard rather, is a contributor, particularly during, Fidelity commute hours and others as well. It's not something that I've actively thought about, and I need to give it some further consideration.
Alderman Jettie.
Thank you. Yeah, so Alderman Clemmons, you're absolutely right. There are people who are doing that now. I know people who live in Milford and commute to Massachusetts, and that's exactly what they do. They take Continental Boulevard over to the Turnpike to avoid Amherst Street in Nashua. And, you know, and as far as the ownership of that, I'm not sure how it ended up, but I know as part of the getting rid of the tolls in Merrimack, I think Merrimack had to take that road. I think that was part of the deal.
Okay.
And I know that they didn't like it, and they may have reversed that since then, but I know at one time, the state agreed to do away with the tolls if Merrimack took ownership of that Continental Boulevard. But as far as the money for this study, I know you keep talking about it and you keep thinking about it as a land use study, but, and we keep saying, well, it's gotta be a traffic study as well. And I'm just wondering if, because the state recognized it as a, you know, a road that needs a priority treatment, I'm just wondering if there would be money available from the state to do the traffic study part of it. Not only that, but what Alderman Clemmons is talking about, you know, connecting the Continental Boulevard portion of it to help alleviate the pressure on Amherst Street.
Director Sullivan.
A couple of things, I think. One, in fact, I think NRPC might be the organization that's best positioned to provide us with support in this work. You know, they're active in their traffic count work and other transportation planning efforts, and so if there's any organization that's actually resourced right now to assist us, it's them. You know, one of the challenges I think with securing state funding for this is that the advantage is that we have a project in the 10-year plan that is potentially going to be done and it has some level of funding allocated to it. The disadvantage is that we have a project in the 10-year plan that has some funding allocated to it. And what I mean by that is I believe it's unlikely that the state of New Hampshire would agree to conduct a speed or other study or safety study of the corridor when it's currently programmed to have some of that work done in the future. But I don't know, and so it should be investigated. Generally, I would say that, you know, a speed or other traffic study should be scientific in nature. It shouldn't involve the articulation of priorities necessarily, but I think that the city and the state do have different priorities, and so I'd be a little hesitant for them to undertake work with a different frame of mind as to what they think the outcome will be. And so I'll do a little investigation into what funding might be available. What I'm hearing and what I do need to acknowledge is that while this is a land use study, it is equal parts a traffic study, no question, and a study of transportation networks along the corridor. And so whether there are alternative funding sources with that in mind, I'll do a little more work on that before coming back and certainly requesting anything in the budget. So noted, and I need to get back to you with that answer.
Thank you.
All right. Without objection, I would ask that the committee ask Director Sullivan to move forward with this concept and return here with a more, or to the full board or whomever with a more complex, detailed plan incorporating the feedback you received from committee members. Seeing no objection.
And what I'll also do, Alderman Moran, if you're comfortable, is I can provide some examples at a subsequent meeting of what this might actually look like. And apologies for not doing that tonight, but I think that might help you all get an understanding in advance of the budget season what would actually be generated as part of this work, because there are a variety of different types of corridor studies. Even the one that's being done along West Hollis Street is slightly different than what we're thinking here, because it doesn't involve a lot of land use recommendations and implications where this one might. So anyway, I will come back to the committee with more information.
Thank you. All right. it seems like you also talked a lot about the land use code. Is there anything that you wanted to dive in deeper?
I can be brief. I wanted to provide just a brief update this evening on some of the initial activities of the land use code. If you're not aware, we hit the press on Friday and over the weekend with a press release talking about the fact that we're kicking off this initiative. But I wanted to just quickly talk about a few things this evening that are sort of in the shorter term, I guess. And to give you a sense of what I mean by shorter term, and I'll distribute all this information, so Alderman Clea, I see you taking a picture.
Yep.
I'll make sure you get this, and that's quite all right. And before this Vision Week, and I'll talk about this in just a second, one of the things that Manager Durfee and I are going to be doing is reaching out to each one of you and the other members of the board to sit down to have a conversation about what your priorities and what your ward's priorities might be when it comes to land use and different components of the code. And so expect that outreach from us over the coming week, if not in the coming 2 days. And we'll also, we have a very clear schedule that we'd like to stick to. And so we're trying to get some initial sense of priorities from you as we head into the engagement that will be part of this plan. It's a really important part of this. And so I'll distribute a more full schedule, but one of the sort of the first initial events that we're looking at, and we'll be coordinating with the ward alderman in some of these cases, is some of these broad visioning events in areas that were areas of focus within the Imagine Nashville Master Plan. So we're going to have an Amherst Street visioning session. I know it's really hard to read, and I'm sorry for that.
That's why I take pictures, so
Yep,
I can make
yep.
it bigger.
So I'll distribute this after, but between March 11th and March 13th, we're going to be doing a variety of different engagement efforts, and we're working to build the programs for these right now. Again, you don't need to write these down. We'll make sure that they're distributed. But these will include a variety of different sort of, drop-in events, structured presentations, all with their each sort of unique, their own format, including some general open studio time Monday to Friday that we'll be holding at the Hunt Memorial Library. So thanks to the Economic Development team and Amy DeRoche for having us up there. We're going to sort of be set up at the Hunt building for a lot of this initial engagement. And so I'll probably invite you all to stop by at some point in time just to see what we're working on, because we're working with a really great team, a consulting team named Principal, who's bringing a level of expertise and design experience to this code that we're really, really excited about. We're then going to be moving into Tree Streets visioning, really focusing on the Tree Streets area between March 14th and March 16th. Somewhat of a similar schedule there. We'll be moving between the auditorium, the Hunt Memorial Library, and then possibly doing some engagement with PAL as well to get some other folks that maybe aren't traditionally involved in the land use code process actually engaged and thinking about what they'd like to see in their area. And then moving into some of the events on the 15th and the 16th, we're going to be doing all sorts of fun things, a scavenger hunt. Don't ask me the details of that just yet, but we're going to make it exciting. We promise you that. But we're really trying to find a variety of different ways to engage folks in this process that may otherwise not be the most exciting in the world. We're trying to get innovative a little bit here. And so more details on all of those events to come, and I'll distribute this after the meeting tonight. But we'll be actively participating with, of course, the ward aldermen and the aldermen at large and any others who'd like to participate to make sure that these events are reflective of what your collective constituent bodies are looking for.
Director Sullivan, 2 questions for the shop owners and business meeting. I think that's what it says.
Yes.
Have you partnered with the chamber?
Yes, so we have a group of community connectors that we've been engaging with, ranging from small business owners to include Wendy Hunt at the chamber as well. We generally, I would say, have very good points of contact for all of these events. We're still searching for a few to make really solid connections, but we're sort of relying upon those community connectors to help us think through how to put on some of these events and how to build momentum behind them as well. And so yes, we are hopefully involving the right folks when planning each of these.
And I'm going to beat Alderman Jetty to this, but have you advertised this in the Telegraph?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So the answer is no. What we're going to be doing is over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a rollout of these events about a month out. But we have not advertised it in the Telegraph. Manager Durfee and I were talking about this just before we came over today. We're going to be doing all sort of the customary methods, community TV, social media, press releases and stories to news media that will pick us up. And certainly the Telegraph, I think, would be one of those. We certainly wouldn't want to forget that.
Any questions for Alderman Tebow?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Does that say codes and coffee?
Yes.
Okay. So I see a lot of these things that are happening at the Hunt Building. The only thing I worry about there, it's like 9 to 6:30, Monday through Friday. If it rains, that place turns into a mess. Although I am glad to see the economic development is finally using their space.
We're going to stay out of the rainy part.
Okay.
We'll be in the dry section of the building.
Is there one?
Yes.
All right,
Yes,
thank
the
you.
individual rooms are dry. That entryway it rains.
Any other questions? Alderman Govea.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a quick question. Where it says 2 Broad Street, how far down Broad Street are we talking? I think I remember reading, but is that all the way to Hollis Broad Street, or is that to the Highway Broad Street?
So that is to, let me use that question to pull something up, Alderman Gouveia, if that's okay. So I did want to just quickly mention, we also have a project website that's fully built. And on this project website, there's certainly a schedule of events, and this is probably how I'll share all of these details with you in addition to direct emails. But here in this website, we have sort of some geographic focus areas mapped out. And so I'm happy to walk anyone through these tools and how to use them. But really when we're talking about Broad Street to Main Street, we're talking about the Amherst Broad Street split down to the Main Street intersection at the Hunt Building. That sort of section that's outlined in the polygon right there. I would just note that all of the other areas, the Tree Streets neighborhood, Amherst Street, all the other corridors outlined right here on the side, there's a little bit more detail about each of these and how sort of the Imagine Nashua plan talks about them, what the objectives were as we move into the code update. We wanted all this information to be publicly available so that folks aren't having to go back to the Imagine Nashua plan to pull that up. So hopefully this website will be a really critical link and place to find the most dynamic and up-to-date information on the process moving forward.
Alderman Jetting.
Yeah, and when you say this website, where do people find this website?
The web
So-
address?
Yep, that's a great question, Alderman Jetty. We're actually working on putting a tile up on the front of the Nashua City Government page so that there's a land use tile. And then it will be referenced through our community development page and our planning department's page. And then what we're working on right now, which is a little bit above my pay grade, but I'm told is very important, is the idea of making sure that when someone searches for the Nashua Land Use Code update, that this is the first thing that pops up. And so there's this sort of search engine optimization piece that we need to work through so that folks are seeing this early.
I'm familiar with that. And I'm sure Alderman Govea is being a marketing person, but
Yeah.
loading the search terms into the website itself.
Yep, and so that's critical to us, and then, on all of our materials that go out, Alderman Jetty, and, thank you to COVID for this, we're including a QR code that goes directly to the website on all of the printed materials and other things that are out there, and so someone sees it, grab the phone, do the regular, picture scan thing, I'll take you directly to the project website as well, and that's on all of our marketing materials.
Thank you.
Alderman Clee.
So this does not exist yet, because I'm looking at your projects and it's not there yet?
It's not listed in the
Okay.
project site, but the page is live, it's just not something that we've posted just yet, we're gonna be doing that this week.
Okay.
I was able to Google it and it came up pretty easily.
So what
I just did
groups?
recode Nashua and it
Okay,
popped
Code
right up.
Nashua. Thanks.
Yep. But it's not listed on our projects page just yet, that's correct.
Seeing no further questions, just brief discussion of our future agenda items, recovery housing and abutter notification.
Yes, so just subject for future discussion, I sent a communication to the board over the weekend relative to some questions that we've been receiving about recovery housing or housing for those living those in recovery currently. This is something that arose most recently around a situation at 16 Archery Lane that I think you're all aware of. There's obviously been some engagement by elected officials, and so As I said in my email, and I didn't mean to be frustrating when I said this, but it's true. We're trying to collect information and details about what's actually being proposed. Unfortunately, in this situation, work began without permits, and there was a stop work order issued, and so we're in a bit of a less than ideal situation with the property generally. That said, the property owner, or operator has been very forthcoming with information. They've been very clear that they want to be, ideally, if they do move into the property, they want to be a good member of the neighborhood. That said, there are some outstanding concerns that we have about the number of occupants and specific uses taking place in the property. And so I referenced a presentation given by Bill McKinney, the building official, several months ago. I would recommend looking at that. The city has generally taken a very, I would say, a progressive approach to how we sort of think about and codify and really look at recovery housing in the context of our land use code. But we certainly recognize that in the sort of the standard of you know it when you see it, there might be instances where certain properties go above and beyond that interpretation. And so that's sort of what we're trying to parse right now, but we should have some further detail available over the coming week as we work to get information. Yes.
For the, I believe we have the plan for next month's meeting. Would it be practical to announce it as like maybe a listening session and invite the owner to speak to ward members of the public who might want to come here and ask questions or make a statement and have a collaborative back and forth? Or
I do have some concerns about that approach, and just to justify what those concerns might be focused on, it's possible that this owner may need to proceed through a land use regulatory process or other application process in a formal sense with the city.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'd be concerned a bit about sort of intervening while we're in the midst of those processes. I don't know that will be the case, but I'd also just mention that Alderman Thibodeau has been very clear that he's concerned about his constituents as well, and so it's possible that he might be sort of, I would say, facilitating a conversation with some of the concerned residents. I know that they've been in contact with me, and so I think that's a great question. I would suggest that we maybe hold on that until we have a better sense of what the proposal actually is and what the process will be that it needs to go through. But I think Alderman Thibodeau is doing a great job of engaging with the folks that are really possibly directly impacted. But maybe that's something we can discuss in advance of the next meeting.
And I cut you off, so please continue.
No, that's all right. I was just going to comment. I am naturally, whether it's this evening or part of a one-on-one discussion that we're going to be setting up with you, we're happy to talk about other land use topics at this meeting. I do want to try when attending these, and this goes for folks on my team and others as well, to actually have something prepared for you to actually respond to and have some input on. And so, we'll try to have a sense about a month out of what the topics might be for the next agenda item. We'll try to coordinate those as much as possible with actual action items that this committee might undertake or pieces of legislation, rather than just coming here to entertain you on something that may not be relevant to current business within the city. We'll try to focus our agenda items on that in consultation with you, Mr. Chair. I do know there are some other items out there that will somewhat line up with our land use code update, but may require more immediate attention. I know there's been some questions about different forms of abutter notification or other land use processes that we want to talk about. I'm happy to incorporate those and support conversations on those and on future agendas, but didn't have anything specific for the remainder of tonight.
Great. Alderman Jettie.
Thank you. So the, when you're talking about Nashua Recode, you're talking about the land, revising the land use code?
Yes.
That's what we're talking about?
Yep.
Now, didn't we hire a consultant some time ago?
Yep.
And what's the status of that? I thought we were gonna be, getting a new land use code any second now, but no, this is, we're not, where are we in that whole process?
George O'Sullivan.
Yes, so a new land use code consultant was hired about 4 months ago, Alderman Jettie. And so to your point, I just looked at a presentation that I had done before this committee a year ago, and I think that we said we were going to be done with the land use code in June of 2024. That's not going to happen. We're on a timeline to complete by mid-2025, so still within the term of these members of PEDC. And frankly, that's still fairly short. It's a year and a half. Most land use code processes are taking between 3 and 5 years, and I'm hoping we can beat that average. But we've just recently engaged the consultant. They've been putting together this sort of comprehensive outreach engagement and sort of drafting schedule. And so as I note right here, we're intending to have at least a public draft available for read and reaction by August of 2024. But one of the things I want to be really clear about is what's going to be going on in between now and then is all community outreach and engagement to support drafting provisions of the code that are actually reflective of what the community wants and certainly what the master plan articulated. And so we were delayed, but we're going to be very busy over the coming 6 months, particularly preparing that first public draft. So you will have a new land use code draft, hopefully in August of 2024. We anticipate significant conversation on that in the year that follows. And yes, a year. We're going to be bringing different sections to you for detailed discussion. There's going to be a different format to the code than what currently exists right now. Though we'll be maintaining a lot of components of it. But it's going to be a tremendous amount of work by this committee, by the planning board, and certainly by the public as well, to support this over the next year and a half. And so we are delayed, but we're moving very quickly now that we have our consultant on board to get out to the public and get their feedback.
Follow up?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm glad to hear that we're going to be revising the format, because the current format is very difficult to find what you need, and so that's good. So thank you for that, for bringing me up to speed on that. And I just want to say, when you say that if we have questions, you'd appreciate knowing about them ahead of time so that you can properly prepare and give us an answer that you can stand behind, and I appreciate that. By the same token, when you come to us with something, I hope my fellow committee members agree with me on this. I find it very frustrating when somebody comes to a meeting and hands us a memo that we've never seen before and talks about it like we're all very familiar with it. And sometimes, we're having a public hearing and we're having a meeting and people expect us to vote on an ordinance that night when we're just, we've just been, getting the information. So as much as you can, if you're gonna present us with something, if you could send it to us ahead of time,
Sure.
so we could read it before we come to the meeting, so we can ask intelligent questions, I know I would appreciate that very much.
Understood.
And I'm going to accept partial responsibility for that statement that Alderman Jetty has made, because my naive nature of the first 2 years as chairman, I think I'm going to engage Alderman Director Sullivan more in that realm, so that we can make sure the committee is up to date on things as they're happening, rather than wait till the last minute and you're getting an email from me the day before type of thing. I think I want to be more approachable with him as he's been with me. Unless you don't want that, I go.
No. I don't want to be approached. No, and I Alderman Jetty, I'm sensitive to that, and I think particularly you just outlined a distinction that I think is important, and that is with legislation particularly. I think there's a level of we as staff certainly ambition to, and I hope you will see, act to put complete information in front of you before you're making a decision. And so I agree with you completely there. There are some items, it's a balance in some cases. In many cases, we want to be sensitive to coming to this group before we've formulated any specific recommendations or language or the like. And so giving tonight as an example, and I think you might agree with me here, we're so early in this conversation, this sort of is how it should happen, where we have a conversation about the corridors. we review all the discussion to date about these different areas, and then we move forward and come back to you with maybe a more specific ask. But I know I speak for myself and my colleagues that, well, we're all very busy and we're working, and sometimes we aren't as diligent with getting materials in when perhaps we should. We're always working to try and improve that, and we know that, you know, we agree, and we experience it in our own professional life too. It's unfair to ask for productive feedback and informed feedback if we're not getting that information to you early. And so we'll continue to work on it, and I completely, I understand and respect that that's something that's important to you, and I expect it is for others as well.
Thank you.
Appreciate that answer, by the way. Alderman Tebow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I think sometimes, I think honestly, if I had to say, I thought you guys generally do a good job of getting us stuff. I think, you know, last week we got something, because I think sometimes it's back and forth, and then there's information given the day of that we probably should read, but yet it comes in email, and we have a real job, some of us, so we don't get a chance to read it that quick, or reading it right before, or hey, did you see that email? No, what email? It's like, and it's not to anybody's fault, except someone asked the question and then someone has to answer it, and that's part of the information we need, and we didn't get it. So I can see that. I mean, we came in last week to something where I think some of us hadn't got a chance to read it yet, and it was like, oh, and again, it wasn't you or your team or anything, but stuff does happen. So it's just,
Yeah,
I think you guys
does.
do a good job generally, but it can happen.
Just a quick comment, and that is to say that I don't want to pretend that that won't happen. You know, that there might not be the occasional time that I'm not timely, or someone else might not be timely. I think what we then try to do is to provide an explanation during the time when it's considered on the agenda. That's not always possible, but I'm stating the obvious here, but we certainly at no point in time intend to spring anything on anyone, and so certainly we need to make sure that you know that that's the case, but we'll try to act that way moving forward too. And I think we generally do a really, really good job, but we're scrambling sometimes, and I'll be very candid about that.
Sometimes when there's a sense of urgency, sometimes details don't get read. Alderman Clee.
Thank you. Two comments, one towards each of you. I appreciate the documents coming to the committee members, but as a person who attends meetings that I'm not a committee member, so if the whole board could get something as important as this, I would really appreciate it, rather than me coming and going, can I take yours and go run and make a copy of it? I think it would be helpful.
Is that a reach to ask Donna to send it out to the full board? Are these documents that you're sharing with the subcommittee?
No, I don't think that it is. Again, I think this is perhaps more applicable with documents that aren't presentations. You know, I'll be very frank with you. I mean, presentations like this, particularly, are often being put together very close to when the meeting is happening. I'm not going to hide behind that. I can hear Director Cummings laughing. I think he understands that too. Sometimes that's just the way it happens. But if there's a draft of an ordinance or an example of a corridor study, I don't, and nor does anyone else, we don't want to drop that on you at the meeting. We recognize you need to have that in advance. What I would just ask, maybe speaking specifically for this committee, sometimes what might happen then is that we send out an email subsequent to when you receive the agendas on Friday through Donna and the legislative office. And it may not be 36 hours in advance, it may be 48, but we can certainly try and get documentation to you. Again, I think we do a fairly good job of this, but certainly I hear the comment, and I think we could always be ambitioning to do better.
Alderman Clee?
Thank you, and I think I just forgot what I was going to ask. Oh, yes, I do remember. Thank you. And it is to Director Sullivan. When you're talking about doing this future outreach, you talk about the Code Week, and first public draft and so on. When you're working on these, are you working with the local developers and so on, those people that will be either building, potentially building and so on, and hearing what would help work with them? Not that we're going to cater to them, but to hear their conversation more than just in the general public as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when you see that focus group bullet item up there, When Sam and I were sort of putting together the approach here, we identified a variety of different groups, from business owners to developers to, our engineers and surveyors that we work with frequently. They are being engaged as part of this process. I will say that the development community, and colleagues in the audience know this as well, development community is a bit more, it's a bit more challenging in some ways, because to get the kind of feedback that's very helpful and productive for us, it sometimes requires a one-on-one touch and a level of sort of anonymity with the development community to get really, really good quality feedback that I think they are willing to provide. But the bottom line is that we are engaging with them. We've had very active conversations with sort of frequent flyers in the city of Nashua about what their sort of points of tension have been in the current land use code. And when we're coming up with new language, we're going to be meeting with them directly to, perhaps not get them fully bought in because they may not totally agree with everything that's in there, but to get a level of comfort as to whether they understand what the regulations would be asking for. They're arguably one of the most important stakeholders in this entire thing. So yes, they are being engaged.
Thank you. We appreciate that.
Right. Thank you, Director Sullivan. And seeing no further questions, communications,
There is none.
unfinished business,
None,
petitions,
none,
new business resolutions,
there is none,
new business ordinances,
none,
tabled in committee,
none.
general discussion. Thank you so much, Director Sullivan. I know before the meeting, he said I'm gonna make this super quick. Not at PEDC. All right, tabled in, no, public comment. No members of the public. Remarks by Alderman? Nope. All right, and Alderman Govea.
I move to adjourn.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? And we are adjourned at 8:46 PM.